Order, order. Welcome to this afternoon session of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you very much indeed for coming. We're going to start with our first question, if we may, going straight to Priti.
Thank you, Chair. Well, this is highly topical in terms of, obviously, the theme that we're here to discuss and talk about global media freedoms today. And I'd really like to start asking, really, the questioning of all of you. In light of what we're seeing now, threats in terms of media, journalists, sort of rife and epidemic in some parts of the world, why, in your view, are so many journalists continue to be killed around the world? And if you wouldn't mind also touching on journalists that are killed outside of war zones in particular, please.
Okay. So my name's Julie Posetti. I'm a research fellow with the University of Oxford's Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I have done quite a bit of research for UNESCO on a range of issues that intersect with this. I think I'll focus and defer to Jackie on some of the physical threats and details surrounding the murder with impunity of journalists internationally. From my perspective, it's a combination of threats and a convergence of threats, so offline and online threats. So we're now seeing the weaponisation of journalism, if you like, by political actors internationally, particularly those operating in despotic contexts, but also I think we can identify actors within the West. So they might be in Eastern Europe. We've seen incidents in Eastern Europe where journalists have been targeted and murdered. We've seen the same in Latin America. But we've also seen, for example, in the US, the demonisation of journalists and the deployment of terms designed to whip up sentiments that are designed to cause a mob reaction, whether that's online or offline. When you have an online mob attacking and assaulting journalists and journalism, the risk of that overflowing into the physical realm increases, particularly when we see threats like technological threats like deep fake videos, for example, where AI technology is used to try and misrepresent journalists. We'll go into this later, but female journalists being targeted in particular, being misrepresented as porn stars, exposing them to increased physical risk in their own environments. So we have a combination of technological factors, existing failures in terms of the international legal and normative frameworks that exist and the domestic ones, and these digital threats. And I think I'll leave my response there.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my name's Jackie Harrison, and I'm from the University of Sheffield, and I run a centre called Centre for Freedom of the Media, and I'm a UNESCO Chair, Media Freedom, Journalism Safety and the Issue of Impunity. We study a lot of this, and what you find is that it's a lot of what's happening is overlapping. So it's part of it is one of the drivers is impunity. Yes, one of the drivers is impunity, the fact that individuals or groups can attack journalists with impunity, which also then is about disregard for the rule of law, but then that also emboldens other actors to do the same, and on it goes. So there is definitely a spiral there of impunity. Journalism itself is sort of becoming more potent. It's seen in some respects as something that actually can destabilise political regimes. That can be for good or for bad. But the power of journalism, its power to destabilise, is something that quite often individuals want to close down. And half of the killings now, to come back to your point, are actually undertaken in non-conflict zones. And I think that's the chilling aspect. It's both an attack on the idea of journalism itself, the conceptualisation of it, how important it is, to try and diminish its standing as, I would say, an institution of civil society. But it's also about being entitled. The entitlement to attack journalists is not undermined by the very responsive journalism to those attacks. In other words, we go down this route of impunity, lack of public information, disinformation, and on it goes. So part of the problem is sometimes the civil standing or status of journalists and journalism in different contexts, and that really is something that needs to be, I think, addressed as part of maybe the narrative around all of this, rather than it being linked to democracy or any other kind of big concept. If you think of journalism as being part of civil society building, then actually its attack is a form of civil diminishment, which undermines that very, very process. and that's part of it. Do you want me to talk about the range of threats and hazards?
I would like to know what other threats are out there. I mean, I know we've touched on technology, but I think the range of threats in particular would be helpful.
Sure. I mean, they range from the ultimate form of censorship, which is a killing, and you can go through arbitrary detentions, kidnapping, psychological threats, online threats, attacks that are physical but not lethal. They can be intimidatory, they can be shutting down news organisations, they can be destroying kit. I mean, it goes on. It is actually a scale. And at the end of that scale, I would say one of the other threats is the attack on the idea of journalism itself. So that's part of that whole sliding scale. And you find, our research has shown that when a journalist is killed, it's very unusual for that killing to just be out of the blue. There's usually been a range of attacks or threats in the meantime. Those aren't particularly systematically stored in data sets, but we're starting to look at that to see what the story, the event of the killing would tell us via its background, the progress to get to that point.
Can I just come in on that point and just sort of build upon your answer a bit? In terms of sort of news organisations, of course, news organisations naturally have a responsibility for journalists themselves who are out in the field working in some very difficult parts of the world. How do they prepare for, sending journalists in, knowing that they might be going into some of the most horrific environments, and in particular, once, as you've already highlighted, killing doesn't happen automatically. There'll be a spate of activity that would have led to it.
Yes.
What kind of measures do they put in place, and how in particular, I'm sorry to sort of labour this as well, we're here as the FCO committee, the FAC overseeing the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. How do you see sort of the British government and UNESCO and key institutions, giving support out in the field to those that need to be protected, but also trying to give them voice to the actual whole process of what they themselves are trying to report back from the field and stand up and represent?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer to what sort of protections are there and how a journalist is prepared, I think it's very patchy. I mean, it depends on the I suppose, the prosperity of the news organisation, the amount of resources that are going to be put into it. So a lot of news organisations will do a really strong course. They'll send journalists on hostile training, they'll give them kit, they'll insure them, and that's probably, that what most media, I think all media organisations in the UK would do that, and that would be a very important part of it. Around the world, of course, it's a different story, and a lot of the journalists that are getting killed are local journalists who aren't so protected, so they're not insured. If they get injured, they may well lose their job anyway because they can't continue to work. So I think in terms of protections or contributions that can be made, obviously to facilitate news organisations around the world, to help them to understand that journalists do need that level of protection, capacity building amongst media houses as well, because quite often journalists just get cut adrift. And then we've got, on top of that, a whole layer of the freelancers, the informal journalists as well, who are not protected at all. So I think you would have to see it as a multi-layered problem in terms of who gets protections and who doesn't, but to drill down into some sort of capacity building potentially to show that journalists really do deserve that level of protection.
Could I just jump in? I agree very much with what Julie and Jackie have just said. Just to introduce myself, so I'm a human rights barrister, Gallagher QC. I lead the Doughty Street International Media Defence Panel. So that panel includes Helena Kennedy, who did the investigation with Agnes Calamar into Jamal Khashoggi, includes Amal Clooney, who's been appointed in the special role to the Foreign Office, Jonathan Price, who's behind me, who works on a number of cases with me, Jennifer Robinson and others. So there's just a few things I want to pick up on following on what's been said by Julie and Jackie. The first point concerns killings. And some of the work which I do is acting for bereaved families, and I think you may have been alerted by the clerk to the fact that in the room today you have two relatives of journalists who've been assassinated who sit behind me. Paul Caruana Galizia, whose mother Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated in a car bomb in October 2017, and Jeremy Bliss, whose cousin Christopher Allen was killed in South Sudan in August 2017. And it is quite right, as Jackie said, that those assassinations are the ultimate form of censorship. And in Daphne Caruana Galizia's case, it came after decades of harassment and targeting of her and her family. And one of the key issues for that family is that this was an entirely predictable risk, which was then realised in October 2017. And this, of course, happened on European soil, in the Council of Europe, in a European Union country, so not in a war zone. As with half the cases in 2018, this is not a war zone situation. And both Daphne and Christopher were freelancers. And I think that's quite important, given the question you asked about news organisations, because many of those at risk and many of the bereaved families that we work with are people who are operating in a freelance type environment, and they don't necessarily have that form of structure from the BBC World Service or Reuters in the Myanmar case that you may see with others. So that's the first issue, that these don't come out of the blue, and they're part and parcel of a culture over a period of time which often is indicative of risk to those individual journalists, but often is indicative of risk to journalists more generally. I should also say the killings themselves then have a chilling effect on other journalism. And I think it would be very helpful if we could provide you with some more information about the chilling effect on journalism in Malta more generally as a result of Daphne's killing, and what's happening to Caroline Muscat at the Shift and so on. And I understand that the family intends to provide you with written submissions in more detail about Malta. But the killings send a message, and they can have a chilling effect on other journalism. The second point I just wanted to touch on is the fact that I do find quite often that much of the focus, very understandably, is on the very extreme examples. It's on the assassinations, it's on the imprisonment. And in many of the cases that we do, what we see is when someone's released from prison, the spotlight moves. So that happens a lot in Egypt, for example. So when you have a journalist who's released, as my client Amal Fathi was, the international media and press attention moves away, and international diplomatic pressure moves away, when in fact those journalists often continue to be under very extreme restrictions on their ability to report. So Amal Fathi is a good example. She's got a 2-year suspended sentence. She's no longer in custody. She was released over Christmas, but she's got to report back regularly to the authorities, and she's being watched. And it's been made very clear to her that if she reports in a way which the authorities don't like, she'll be back behind bars. So it's important, as well as the extreme examples, we look at that. And then the third point, and final point, I'm conscious of time, is a very powerful example of the wide range of threats to which journalists are exposed and media workers are exposed, is the case of BBC Persian. And one of the BBC Persian journalists, who's also my client, Kazra Naji, is sitting here today. And BBC Persian journalists are journalists who are UK nationals, the vast majority of them. They're based in London, they're here, and they are being harassed and targeted by Iran in a cross-border way. And I think when you were asking earlier about the new emergence of threats, that's a particular issue that really concerns me, and I hope we'll come back to it a little later in evidence. But I think that cross-border nature of threats, so Iran targeting journalists within its own borders, is not unusual. It's done it for many years. Did it to Jason Rezaian. There's many high-profile examples of them imprisoning journalists within Iran. But what is new is this multifaceted way of threatening journalists and using the long arm of the state to try to silence people outside. And that's also a feature in Daphne Caruana Galizia's case, where in fact Daphne Caruana Galizia got a whole series of very threatening letters from UK-based law firms threatening her with multiple libel suits, and indeed her family is still defending posthumously many of those libel suits now. So I think that cross-border issue is a critical one, and we should be alert to that.
In there, because we've asked for submissions from journalists around the world through the International Press Institute, and we've had a few already come in, and we only asked recently, and had some video testimonies that we've put online. And one of them is from Khadija Patel of the Mail and Guardian newspaper in South Africa. And one of the things that she raises is the growing threat of harassment and surveillance of journalists, particularly using electronic means. And I'm aware that one of the great consumers of espionage technology sold by certain states have been countries that would traditionally not be particularly internet capable, but are using these new capabilities specifically domestically to hassle, undermine and deceive journalists in order to spread fake propaganda. Is this the sort of thing that you're seeing against BBC Persia? Is this the sort of thing that you're seeing against others? And what can the UK do to help?
Yes. So the short answer is yes, that is something that we're seeing, and we can provide you. I know you've got a submission from the BBC World Service and indeed from the National Union of Journalists and the International Federation of Journalists giving some detail about BBC Persian. But on this specific issue about the weaponisation of social media, that is very much something that we're seeing. Julie referred to earlier the particular targeting of female journalists, and that's certainly something we're seeing. So what we see is female journalists in particular, and also many male journalists, being the subject of, for example, fake pornography, so material which is circulated about them to try to discredit them in the eyes of the Iranian public. And we have seen in quite horrifying detail, so Kazra, who sits behind me, spoke at the Human Rights Council in Geneva last year. It's the first time that a BBC World Service journalist had addressed the Human Rights Council. And as the result of giving that very powerful speech in Geneva, he and his colleagues have been targeted. And there's a particular role for the international community there. And we've made a complaint on behalf of the World Service to the United Nations about journalists being targeted specifically for using international mechanisms. And we would greatly welcome public support for that from this committee. Now, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Julian Braithwaite in Geneva, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office have been very supportive and have said that they are critical of Iran targeting journalists specifically for using international mechanisms. But that's something that we really must crack down on, because if journalists are targeted for using those mechanisms, it removes a crucial legal avenue for us to put pressure. And that's a trend which I've seen in many of my cases. So a number of my Egyptian cases, for example, when journalists have gone to the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, or when they've gone to David Kay, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, they've then been targeted as a result of that. And that's something which the international community must crack down on.
For a second, and just ask, you will find you're pushing at an extremely open door here when you're asking for support in condemning such action, and you know you are. Indeed, that's why we're holding this inquiry. Can I just ask, what effect does public condemnation have, either at a national governmental level or at a parliamentary level?
So it depends, is the short answer. So, and it very much depends on what the country is. So just to give you a couple of different examples, in the case of Egypt, and I act for a large number of journalists within Egypt, Egypt is responsive to international pressure. So Egypt, when it's criticised at UN level and when it's criticised bilaterally, responds by saying, we're supporters of freedom of expression, here's what it says in our constitution, and they are responsive to that kind of pressure. They're often responsive in a way which means you need to leave sufficient room for them to take some action within their own domestic law. But they certainly are responsive. At the other end of the extreme, you have a country like, for example, Equatorial Guinea, where they don't engage when the UN criticises them. And if you're acting for clients there, we acted for a cartoonist who was detained due to his political satirical cartoons last year. The pressures which need to be placed upon them are different because they're much more responsive to commercial pressure. So I'm afraid the short answer is it depends. But I do think in some of the criticism that you see online when there's a high-profile case and people are shouting from the rooftops about a case, as, for example, they did about the Reuters journalists who were freed this morning, I do think some of that criticism is misplaced, because the reality is that many states, many governments are very responsive to an international spotlight being shone on their cases. And often silence about those cases and speaking only about those cases behind closed doors will only benefit the regime and not the journalist who's detained or being harassed. But it does depend on all the circumstances. There's one specific issue that I wanted to raise, but I can do it later if easier, and it's specifically about impunity and a potential recommendation that we would like to ask this committee to make.
Can we go back to that?
Of course.
Sure. I was just going to add, so I have just finished a report which was published by the Reuters Institute that focused on South Africa and the Philippines and India, specific newsrooms there dealing with a range of media freedom threats and looking at the ways they were responding. So I spent a week with Maria Ressa and her team at Rappler in the Philippines, and she's become, a cause celeb for speaking boldly and publicly against these threats. And I know she has said publicly before, and she would want me to say again, that the international community's support for her and for her capacity to do independent journalism under threat is something that was very meaningful meaningful, that allowed the organisation, Rappler, to continue to operate with a sense of being shielded. So as much as the international mechanisms are important, there's also the kind of collective action that can support journalists on the ground to continue to report under the threat of enormous pressure and fear of violence. So I think we have multiple roles to fulfil in this regard. And we also have a role, I think, I'm a journalist by training, for the international journalistic community to not just lobby and not just speak in environments like this, but to also report robustly and quite fiercely on some of these threats, because there is evidence that as well, that shining a light and ensuring that we continue to enable our colleagues to speak truth to power makes a difference.
On the imprisonment issue, it's worth saying that in cases where there's been an international spotlight shone, often what we find is that even if the individual remains in prison, their conditions are better and it gives them a form of protection. That's something that Peter Greste in Australia has spoken about very powerfully. But it's all the more important in cases where you don't have a dual national, because I find usually when you have a dual national, so you've got Peter Greste or Mohammed Fahmy, they've already got a government in their corner. And where people are very profoundly at risk is when they're not a dual national. And in those cases, I think it's all the more important that a spotlight is shone, and it certainly protects them, even behind bars. And that's been the story from Peter Greste, from Ibrahim Halawa, from many who've been imprisoned, who've seen their conditions improve because the world is watching.
On that then, on trying to shine a spotlight on some of these persecuted journalists and people that are being locked up, the FCO has been criticised just recently, actually, about how much effort it's put in for a particular journalist. And of course, the FCO would want to do its best for British nationals or for any journalist. I mean, this is a theme that the Foreign Office are picking up for this year. So what is the best way for the FCO to identify and to protect and raise cases of persecution? What is the best way for them to do that? Because people think that when a British national is being persecuted somewhere abroad, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, that the FCO will just intervene and everything will be fine. And of course that isn't the case. So what is the best way for them to do that?
So it does depend on the context. And in many cases that will involve the FCO needing to raise matters at the highest level in their bilateral relations with the country. And then depending on the context, it may be helpful for them to raise it in international fora, such as, depending on the context, within European Union mechanisms and within the United Nations mechanisms. I should say that there's a very powerful example today of the benefit of the Foreign Office speaking out, because, as I know this committee will be very well aware, prior to Jeremy Hunt being in post, Myanmar was not a case on which there were public statements made. And it's very welcome that he did, in fact, make public statements and that he was willing to speak out. And the combination of factors which have resulted in the pardon today and the release of those journalists to their families today, it's multifaceted, but certainly the UK speaking out publicly was very helpful. I should say there are some examples which I have very much in mind, the case of Malta, where the Foreign Office has not in fact spoken out and has not in fact spoken out publicly. And one of the concerns about that for Daphne Caruana Galizia's family is that the Foreign Office should be speaking out particularly about countries where it has influence. So countries like Myanmar, countries like Malta. And one of the concerns we initially had when looking at the proposal for the event in July was that it might be seen by some to be focusing on freedom of expression as a risk far away, in Mexico, in the Philippines. And I think it's essential that in July we have at the centre of that event in July individuals from countries where the UK has great influence, like Malta or the other European Union countries where we've seen 3 journalists killed within the space of 18 months, and then a 4th, Lyra McKee, very recently. And also from people like BBC Persian, who are UK nationals here being persecuted. So I think it's quite important that that happens, and that July isn't simply about free speech being something very far away, but it's also about countries where the UK has great influence, including within the Council of Europe, including within the European Union, and including countries like Iran, where those affected are based here.
Part of the FCO's campaign is to push countries for legislation to protect journalists. Is that the correct priority for the FCO to be doing? I mean, we know that legislation is one thing, but enforcement is something else.
Is that to me? Or I'm happy to answer it.
Whoever, you're all experts.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to add and then pass to Jackie. I think it is important. It's important to enable the local manifestation of international frameworks that are designed to defend human rights, particularly privacy and freedom of expression, which enable the practice of robust investigative journalism, for example. Action and enforcement are obviously problematic. I'm sure Jackie would tell you that Mexico has some of the strongest laws defending journalists internationally, and yet one of the highest rates of murder with impunity. So there's a disconnect between the law and the way in which it manifests. Just by way of one example, this is a book I wrote for UNESCO called Protecting Journalism Sources in the Digital Age. And it is like many other publications that are built on research. This covers 121 countries. That is full of great recommendations and model legal frameworks that can be very useful in informing what is recommended at the global level, but also what is influenced at the local level. So this book goes to something that that the chair referenced earlier in regards to surveillance and the weaponisation of social media, for example, and the way in which it is interfering with the capacity of journalists to do their work through either exposing them to attacks digitally or the undermining of their private communications with sources, which is vitally important to enable ongoing investigative work that holds governments and other power brokers to account. One of the threats that we are seeing emerge to journalists, which we focused on in the post-Snowden era and need to continue to focus on, and it links up with disinformation and journalistic safety, is the ongoing incapacity of existing laws to either be implemented with effect for a digital era or gaps in the existing laws. So to give you an example around source protection, which is the right of a journalist to defend the anonymity of their source or a whistleblower they're working with, which overlaps with all of these issues, we can have a situation where this notebook is able to be protected, but my phone or my laptop will not be. Now, this is not a problem exclusive to countries where the risks are massive for journalists when this kind of intervention occurs, where they're under surveillance or they're forced to have, the data is intercepted, and national security overreach is happening in the West as much as it is anywhere else. So I think one of the things that I would be recommending is that there be a holistic examination which takes into account the physical and the digital, the local and the international, and at the intersection of a range of other issues such as disinformation, which we'll come to. There is a really important, I think, opportunity here to ensure that whatever laws are being considered are understood to be operating in a very complex, multifaceted environment.
And I think one of the things that is often forgotten in implementing things from the top downwards is actually the everyday lived experience of people. And it's important, I think, that is very much part of whether it's academia who brings that to the party or whether there's some other research on the ground, because quite often there's, as Julie said, there's a massive disconnect between the intentions through law, through different structures and frameworks, and the actual experience that's, journalists are living through every day in different places. So, as I said, the part of it is about helping with capacity building. Part of it is also about encouraging political leaders and condemning them if they start to denigrate journalists. It's a bigger, wider framework than just sort of changing the laws. The laws are obviously incredibly important, but it's also more about the culture in which journalists operate, and also trying to build civil societies and capacity building. Journalism isn't something that just is free at some point. It should be part of civil society building, state building, development, and so it tends to be the thing that's always thought, right now we can turn to free journalism because a society is improving. It has to be part and parcel of the development of that society, and I think that's really important to include those kind of sentiments in any kind of intervention and invest in that, provide resources to do that, whether it be improving regulatory bodies, improving media literacy for audiences. So it's a big picture.
So I have 3 quick points just following on. I won't repeat anything Julie and Jackie have said. I very much agree with what they said. The first thing is I do think the reform of legislation is an important focus for the Foreign Office, but it shouldn't be the exclusive one. I think the UK has a particular role to play, particularly in relation to anti-terrorism legislation and so on. Many of the times the laws which are used against journalists are a colonial overhang, and they come originally from us, I'm afraid. I say as an Irish person, I'll be criticised for that. But the question's a very good one, I think, because there is a fundamental mismatch often between legal standards and enforceability on the ground. And in all of those examples that I've given, you have countries which have a constitution that parrots free speech. Many of those countries have signed up to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Many of those countries are European countries, which are subject to the European Convention on Human Rights and the Charter, for example. And even still, you see this difficulty. And that's why the recommendation I mentioned earlier that we very much have in mind concerns the issue of impunity. And it's this. A common thread in the 3 European cases involving the deaths of journalists in 2017, 2018, so Jan Kuciak and his fiancée in Slovakia, Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, and Victoria Marinova in Bulgaria, is concerns in Council of Europe and European Union member states regarding the rule of law and the inadequacy of the investigation mechanisms. And impunity is about much more than some of the submissions you might suggest, which refer just to perpetrators being jailed, because impunity is also about a failure to investigate whether there's any state accountability in those cases, so whether the risks to life were known, whether those deaths could have been prevented. And that's critical to learning lessons so that things change going forward. And the situation we've got in all of those cases is that even though they are ECHR countries, they're countries where the Convention applies, there has not yet been an investigation in any of those countries into whether or not the deaths were preventable. And that's something that the Caruana Galizia family have been calling for a very long time, since August 2018, something which has been supported at the highest level within the European Union and within the United Nations, although interestingly not publicly by this government. And that is something that the family call for. They do call for support for their request for a public inquiry into the question of whether Daphne's death could have been prevented. And what we saw in Jamal Khashoggi's case, where clearly Saudi Arabia wasn't going to conduct an investigation into what happened, and the investigation which was taking place within Turkey, there were some question marks about that. And the situation there is that Agnes Kalamar, Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, stepped into the void and on an ad hoc basis created an investigation. And the international community has no way of having a standing mechanism which investigates these cases. And it really doesn't seem to me good enough to have a situation where ultimately in 6 or 7 years' time the Caruana Galizia family could be told in the European Court of Human Rights there should have been an investigation, by which time the evidence trail is cold. And a really practical recommendation, I think, is there has got to be some form of standing mechanism which can in fact investigate these cases at the right time. And the European Centre for Media and Press Freedom in Leipzig, there's a lady there called Flatura Kasari, and a number of us are working with her on that issue. But I think that's a really concrete issue, that there needs to be an investigation into the absence of a mechanism, because actually it's all very well the European Convention saying this family is entitled to an investigation. It's not good enough to get a legal finding that that right was breached in almost a decade's time. They need an investigation now. And that's a fundamental gap in the mechanism, where the law says one thing, but there's no enforceability mechanism. And that feeds impunity, and that means we don't learn lessons, and bereaved families don't get fundamental answers about what happened to their loved ones.
And just briefly on that, then, if we can't get an investigation and a review into some of these cases that are covered by the European Convention on Human Rights, what hope does the UK have of influencing other people, other countries around the world who are probably far worse? What hope do we have?
It's a very good question, and that's why I raised the Malta example, because Malta is a very small country within the European Union. We've great influence on Malta. So why is it that the Foreign Office has not called for a public inquiry in relation to the death of Daphne Caruana Galizia?
It's a separate question. I appreciate that, and you are right. But my point being is that it's a big world, and there's a lot of this going on. So what hope can we have of influencing those other countries if we can't even influence the likes of Malta?
Well, I think it depends on what efforts are made to try to influence, because in fact the UK has had great influence, and I really commend and thank the Foreign Office for much of the help they've given us in many of the cases that we've done which have involved dual nationals in particular, where they have been very influential, sometimes publicly, sometimes behind the scenes. But I do think at the moment that the focus is on non-Council of Europe, non-EU states, and on the countries which are closest to home and where we can potentially have most influence. There's silence. And that's the concern for me more is, why are they not speaking about these cases? And the Myanmar example I gave is a powerful one, because you see actually the Foreign Office has had real influence, and predecessors to the current Foreign Secretary had not spoken out about that case, and he now has, and quite rightly he's spoken out about that case.
Thank you.
Sorry, did you want to jump in on this, Catherine, before Conor?
This theme about looking at Europe. The Council of Europe produced a report in February of this year where it highlighted in great detail the chilling effect that was being had across Europe. It went as far to say that a culture of impunity has taken hold in many parts of Europe. Excuse me. It also talked about the fact that countries like Hungary and Italy had seen a dramatic increase in the number of media alerts. So I suppose two questions on that. Firstly, do you agree with the findings of that report that said press freedom in Europe is more fragile now than it has been at any time since the Cold War? And secondly, how can countries like the UK, which are very prominent members of the Council of Europe, work to address the fact that 130 journalists in its member state, the majority of those in Turkey, are being held in detention? So that's to whoever feels not to answer that.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, the report itself is chilling. I think it's reflecting some of the things I said earlier about the way that journalism is perceived. I think that when we look at impunity, of course it is about legal frameworks, but there is a politics of impunity that we've actually researched and talked about at the University of Sheffield, which is where journalists themselves get cast into spaces of exception almost, where they are not protected by national laws or international, beyond the reach. And so again, these things are terribly important because it makes those journalists less accessible, less touchable, we're less able to talk about some of these in public. So the fact that, as you were saying, it's very, very hard sometimes to actually get to the heart of the issue. So there has to be a concrete way of using the laws that we have, using the influence we have, to look at what's happening to journalists and to condemn it in the strongest possible way in terms of the diminishment of civil societies. In the European context, that's much more possible because we're talking about democratic states with vibrant civil societies. So what you've got there is something very pernicious, antagonistic areas of interaction that are developing through right-wing politics, partisan news media, echo chambers. And it was very striking, even in World Press Freedom Day, when we were talking about with the problems facing journalists around the world, that countries that don't have a free press, that are down the partly free or even at the bottom of the league, are facing the same sort of issues that we're facing now in Europe. So, but in the European context, we can actually say there are mechanisms there. There are, there's the acquis communautaire, there's things that we can use in the context of the EU. There are particular triggers that can be used and mechanisms, and I think it's so important that it's called out for what it is in that context, because it's not the same in every world region, and we can't just look at our backyard and say, well, it's pretty okay, and most of those countries are in the free part of the index. I think we have to call it out and condemn it where it's happening with possibly even more strength and more political clout than when it's in a place where you can see it's a fragile state with all sorts of other difficulties and poor infrastructure and possibly no rule of law that works to support journalists, because it's very, very easy to go down the slippery slope and to lose what we've got. So I would say that possibly is one of the most important things that can be done.
I would add that it's vitally important to critique the culture of impunity, or the culture of denigration of journalism and journalists as well. It's not just Western Europe, it is the US, where you have an environment where journalists are being declared to be, quote, fake news, the enemy of the state or the enemy of the people. This has two effects. It exposes the journalists in that state or that country to increased threats, They are physical threats, they're digital threats, enormous psychological impacts of online harassment, which I hope we can get to, that have a very chilling effect on the capacity of journalists to do their job, which threaten to overflow into the physical realm, but also which are causing women journalists around the world, multiple research publications have confirmed they're withdrawing from public activity. Critics and analysts who participate in public debate are withdrawing. But the secondary effect of that kind of enabling culture where journalists are seen as fair targets for abuse and physical attack. I mean, we don't have to, we can go to CNN with the pipe bomb, situation. If a very recent example of this in a very environment of tolerance and a history of empowerment of journalistic rights. When a state enables that kind of attack and assault on journalists of a state like the US, a state like Malta, we can go, many other Western countries, Hungary, Turkey, and so on. The very worst impacts of that kind of behaviour in states in, say, Africa, parts of Latin America, where the cost ultimately is more frequently the loss of life of a journalist or the imprisonment for prolonged periods of a journalist. When another state that we are not critiquing, whether we being the West, the UK, my own home country of Australia, where we are not standing up to condemn that kind of licensing of the assault and abuse of journalists, we risk not only the journalists in those countries in the West, but we also dramatically increase the risk to the journalists in the most vulnerable countries that we've been talking about. And I think we do need to acknowledge that.
There has been 2 journalists arrested here in the UK in relation to a documentary that they made, Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey. Has that been noticed in Council of Europe in terms of the wider global environment? And do you think it's had an impact on the UK's ability to show its moral repugnance at the curtailment of journalistic freedom in other parts of the world?
The short answer is yes, I think it has been noticed. I'm very conscious of the National Union of Journalists in particular having raised concerns about this and saying, well, if the Foreign Office is going to be dealing with this as a priority, quite rightly, internationally, we've got to get our own house in order here. And how do you explain what's happened with Trevor and Barry? I'm very conscious of that, and I think it's quite right that that's been raised. And there's a related point as well, which goes a little wider, which is I do think it would be very helpful for this committee to consider asking the Minister and the Foreign Office how they're going to ensure that this priority is spread as a cross-government priority, because often what we find is there's a fundamental mismatch between what's being said by the Foreign Office on a particular case and what's being said by other departments, in particular the Home Office. So a very obvious example is something that came up a number of weeks ago at the Committee of the Protection of Journalists when they had an event in London. There was a speaker there from BBC Persian who said, well, many of my colleagues, despite the Foreign Office recognising the risks that we're under, when our family members then apply to come over, were refused visas. And they're told there's no reason why your family member has to come. And I do think that the Foreign Office needs to ensure that if this is a top priority for the Foreign Office, it must be a cross-government top priority. And I think it's quite right that people are raising questions about the Trevor and Barry case. And it's quite right that people are raising questions about visa policy by the Home Office, because that is quite often a trend that we see in our cases, that there's a mismatch between the Foreign Office being very supportive and another government department, most notably the Home Office, not singing from the same hymn sheet.
Catherine, do you want to jump in? Go for it.
I want to praise the committee staff for finding 4 women witnesses, because often we have an all-male panel. But I also wanted to ask about the total number of journalists in the world and the proportion of those who are women, but the proportion who have either been killed tragically like Murray Colvin or others, and just your reflections on what needs to be done, because it's a specific sort of attack on a woman.
Yes.
And in Amnesty's recent report on attacks on Twitter, we know that from women colleagues in the House of Commons, some of them get targeted much more than others. Just want a quick comment from you about that.
I'll start with the online harassment scourge, and then perhaps Jackie can talk about the ways in which women are particularly targeted in the field, if you like. But it's a combination of physical and sexual harassment, IRL, in the real world, where women are working either in their news organisations or in the field. But what I'm specialising in, and where I've seen some really devastating effects, is in the exposure of women journalists to increasingly venal gendered attacks online. So women journalists are targeted specifically because they are perceived to be more vulnerable to the kinds of threats of sexual violence, for example, much as we see in the context of war zones, rape is a weapon of war. In the context of digital harassment, the threat to do sexual harm and violence to you as an individual, to your daughters specifically, frequently that is a threat, to your mothers. So there's this pattern of kind of gendered abuse that leaves women journalists who are targeted feeling exposed and vulnerable. Additional to that is not just the hideous name-calling and the threats that news organisations must take seriously, which takes away from their capacity to do journalism because they're tied up with dealing with all manner of networked assaults on their journalists. But also, women are targeted as a result of orchestrated, often state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. So I can say from my research, which is both for UNESCO and the Reuters Institute, we are seeing a very evident pattern where at the intersection of disinformation and particularly state-based orchestrated disinformation campaigns and gendered online harassment stand women journalists who are targeted specifically to chill their public participation, to chill their reporting and their journalism. It's a huge problem, and in fact I was with Jackie at World Press Freedom Day in Ethiopia last week. I sat on both a panel and then participated in a lab in online harassment. And one of the most both frightening and strangely empowering experiences was women from Africa, Latin America, and all around the world seated around this table who came up to me and a couple of other Western journalists and said, "It's actually a relief to hear that you are going through exactly what we're going through." And when we looked at the notes that had been taken, it was threats, it was fear, it was "I don't want to go to work, I'm quitting my job." This stuff is real and has a really devastating potential, I think, to really impact on the work of independent journalism. In the case of the Philippines, it's now a very famous case of Maria Ressa. South African journalists are trying to use the law to push back against the manipulation and the weaponisation of social media, targeting women journalists specifically in the context of an election. And we also see, in an election context, the closer you get to the election, the worse these attacks become. So there are implications for democracy that are quite significant, I think.
Are there states that are particularly bad? Can you think of which are the worst state actors?
In India, the Philippines, South Africa, in places like Mexico as well. Brazil is an emerging, very serious.
Sure. Be a bit more precise. Those are states in which there is particular targeting and particular violence. Are there any in which the state itself is a particularly bad actor?
Those states.
Oh, those states is okay, right?
Yes. Yep. So I've got this handbook here, which is the Vietnamese copy, which is the only one I could find, but published by UNESCO, demonstrates case studies in each of those countries, although we hadn't yet got to Brazil. But this is proliferating, and as one state successfully practices this kind of disinformation campaign, so often it's caught up with mistruths, deliberate attempts to mislead journalists, to befuddle them, to cause confusion. Disinformation about the journalists is a feature of these attacks, so it will go to their, to undermine their credibility. Will make, the deep fake videos presenting these women as porn stars, for example, in a country like India, particularly a Muslim journalist, Rana Ayub, who was targeted in that context. The risks are enormous. But those are states, and I mean, there's certainly examples of the Finnish journalist, which we might get to, Jessica Aro, who was targeted, she believes, and she's sought to establish this through legal mechanisms by Russian troll farms. So this is a geopolitical a problem, and I think it's something that the UK could potentially take leadership on in terms of raising awareness and building capacity, to echo what Jackie has said, which is vitally important. That goes to training, research, engagement with judicial actors, with law enforcement, but also with news organisations and media development organisations. And I think that intersection between development and media freedom is fundamentally important.
So it's interesting that you mentioned not just the way individual states may be using these, but the way they may be cross-border cooperation using, for example, Russian troll farms.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, the outsourcing of harassment, if you like. Yeah.
But in Russia also you had the murder of journalists. I mean, significant numbers, Mana Politkovskaya onwards, and I still don't think there's been any prosecution, has there?
Not of the mastermind, anyway.
Sorry?
Not of the mastermind, no. The person behind it.
Well, he's in the Kremlin.
So, just following on from that, I mean, just to echo what Julia said, I mean, obviously, countries that have great levels of freedom of expression and have a free press are also precisely the places where attacks on women online are very prevalent. So, again, just to reiterate, this isn't a problem for countries where there is no free press. So, we get that sort of harassment. I think the thing was with women, I mean, they're double targets, and that's really acknowledged everywhere. I don't have the figures, but I can certainly find them out in terms of percentages and proportions of women who've been attacked, if that's useful. And I think one of the other points, I mean, media literacy in schools, education, is also part of that trickle-down approach to building capacity, because it's the people who send these things as well, whether they are political actors or doing it for a prank or doing it out of hatred or whatever it is. It needs to be, women journalists need to be recognised as people with rights, and that comes through education. So again, it's about sustainability and capacity in states. And quite often women in newsrooms, if we're going offline and talking about just their lot as women, they are quite often unlikely to complain anyway. That's one of the greatest problems, that women don't tend to officially complain about harassment or threats. That's partly because they don't think they'll necessarily be taken seriously or protected anyway, but also partly because they think if they do complain, they won't get set out on stories, and somehow they'll be marginalised and finish up covering stories that aren't of high value. So the infrastructure in many places isn't there to protect women in their role.
Just a few quick points. It's a really important question. I'm conscious of an all-male panel being called a manel. I'm not sure what we would be called as an all-female panel, but I'm very grateful. Of course. So just a few quick points. I agree entirely with what's been said, and I'm grateful Jackie's going to give you the numbers that you've asked for. I think it's also important, as well as the pure numbers, to look at some of the features. So in some conflict environments in particular, women are often bloggers and freelancers and are less likely to have the structured support. And that's particularly the case in countries which have poor women's rights protection mechanisms. So you see people like Zaina Erheim, you see people who are bloggers who've actually, because of the power of social media, if they have access to Twitter or Facebook, they can, through some of those new forms of media, become quite influential bloggers commenting in environments which are very risky environments. So as well as the numbers, I think it would be worth us speaking and giving you some more information about some of the features of women journalists. Second point is, I agree with what Jackie said about this being a problem in countries with a free press as well as elsewhere, and it mirrors some of the gendered attacks on women MPs, women human rights defenders and so on. And a good example of that is, in fact, an example of that within a European country is Malta. And I think it would be very helpful. I don't think from the evidence that I've seen that you've got this example, but there's been some very problematic, offensive, misogynistic material circulating on Facebook groups, including Facebook groups in which politicians, very high-level politicians in Malta are members, which has a photograph of Daphne Caruana Galizia, a photograph of Caroline Muscat, who runs the Shift newspaper now, with lines underneath it saying something like, "One witch is dead." And there's misogynistic attacks on a woman journalist now, using the death of a woman journalist, Daphne Caruana Galizia, to fuel that. The third point I just wanted to make is, in some particular states that I'm working in, some of the gendered attacks online are cross-border, and that's why the BBC Persian example is such an important one, because there are many of the journalists who are here. Many of them are probably your constituents. They're based here. They're dual UK Iranian nationals, and many of them are targeted for being women. Many of them have false stories about their sexuality circulating, so suggesting that they're homosexual, suggesting that they're lesbian. Whether they are or they aren't is irrelevant. Many of them don't want to correct that because they see it as suggesting there's something wrong with it. But these rumours are circulated to try to undermine them and undermine their credibility with the audience. And it's something that's being taken very seriously by David Kay, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and we're in the process of making a complaint about gendered attacks by Iran online, and we can certainly provide this committee with that material and with some of the material from David Kay. He did a report on this topic last year. It may be helpful for the committee to see it.
That'd be very kind. Andrew, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Said earlier by Julie that there is a potential for UK leadership in this area. What I'm interested in from all of you really is how that should manifest itself. Clearly, the UK has a very proud history of standing up for freedom and liberties and a rule of law, and yet it seems in this field all of those principles are being broken down, and even by countries that we thought also believed in democracy and the right of free speech. So how do you feel that the UK needs to take leadership in this area? Do you feel more funding is needed for training? Do you feel that our embassies and high commissions should be playing a greater role in this, or other institutions? Should this be something that DFID should take on board and play a part in? Because obviously good governance, freedom of speech is all part of that. How would this actually come to a meaningful, this whole debate today we're having, which is very, very useful and very interesting, very enlightening, I have to say, but where does it lead to? What should Britain do to take this forward?
Do you want me to start?
I'd like to hear from all four of you, but you start, Julie, because you mentioned the
You're
words UK leadership,
yes.
which made me think this is what we need to do.
Yes, I think all of the things that you said, it has to be intersectional. So I would say that we've mentioned capacity building. I think there is a very important role for DFID, both in terms of its international work and its in-country work. I would say that funding, and this is not just a funding plea per se, but tailored funding that targets the skill development of journalists, defensive tactics for dealing with whether it's gendered online harassment or digital era threats such as surveillance. You know, there needs to be physical, face-to-face, wherever possible, training enhanced with any other kind of training and resources that can be developed that comes from a framework of understanding that defends media freedom. There needs to be support for that, investment directly in journalism education, so we're not just talking about training of journalists who are already in the field, but the investment in journalism education specifically to look at these defensive strategies and the international rights that could apply to the journalists in situ. So again, in Ethiopia, I was approached by at least half a dozen very recently empowered journalism educators who came to me asking for help. We need urgent. We don't know how to deal with disinformation. We don't even have digital era skills for storytelling, they're saying to me. And thinking because I'm at the Reuters Institute, I must be able to provide this. So I think those are two very practical ways through, say, BBC Media Action, through the empowerment of the BBC World Service to add value there, and other NGOs that work in those spaces. One word, collaboration, is very important. I think that goes, internationally, cross-border collaboration. The Swedes, the Danes, the Dutch are doing amazing work in these spaces, so there's an opportunity to augment that. But there is also an opportunity to take real leadership, I think, in those spaces of training and development. And just to underline some of the other things that I've said around enabling, let's just take a country like Ethiopia, where there is a new Prime Minister who has specifically said, and Jeremy Hunt was delivering one of the keynote addresses, stating how important this was as an opportunity. Take that opportunity and you need to put the funding behind it. You need to put the research behind the funding that ensures that what is being delivered is robust. And that needs to be done extremely quickly, is the only other thing I would say.
Thank you. Well, I agree with everything you said, so I'm not going to repeat any of those things. I would say that one area that is ripe for development and funding in a way is the SDG 1610 agenda. ensuring public access to information and fundamental freedom. And the two instruments, the monitoring, 1610.1, better ways of collecting data and making it more robust and systematic. We're doing some research on that at the moment, and we've done a gaps analysis. We know that it's patchy. If you're going to hold anyone to account, that needs to be robust, systematic data that's comparable across the world. Also, countries don't keep great records quite often, so you could invest in record keeping so that then we do have the data. Data is evidence. If we can actually gather enough evidence, we can do that as an academic community, we can support some of those mechanisms to collect more robust data, which then allows you to do something concrete. It allows you to say something very specific. We have a journalism safety research network, which is 180 different universities around the world that have joined in on this network. We're a capacity, academics can bring capacity of in-depth research and knowledge in different places. And I would say, approachers, users, we want to research and find things out. We're trying to do that in the context, and we are doing it successfully in the context of the UNESCO Action Plan. And we've got quite a long history of getting involved in various aspects of the implementation of that through research. So we can build that academic research capacity very easily. And of course, and I would say this, that would require funding and commitment, but we would be able to look at everything across the board in a much more in-depth and systematic way and holistic, and support different actors in this multi-stakeholder community that is trying across the board to improve the safety of journalists and media freedom. So I think that's how I would say that you can actually really practically contribute to the media freedom environment globally at the moment.
I greatly welcome the fact that the FCO has indicated that this is a priority, and I think that in itself, as a matter of principle, is something that we should praise. And it's clear from the FCO's submission that it has very laudable aims when it talks about its vision being to be able to reduce the intimidation, harassment and persecution of journalists across the world. But I suspect for those of us on the panel and for this committee, a key issue is how best to be able to do that, but also how can it be measured, and what are the tangible aims, what are the matrices, what are the indices which will show whether or not they've been successful. So 6 months on from the razzmatazz of the July event, how do you see whether or not that's been achieved or is on the way to being achieved? And there's a few key things which I'd suggest. The first is, I think it's quite right that the FCO in its submission at paragraph 5.9 has talked about the importance of using key points in the calendar. So it's talked about, in very general terms in the submission, it's talked about potentially having some commitments which it calls upon people to sign up to at the July event or on the International Day to End Impunity, for example. And I think that's quite right. And while the eyes of the world are on the UK and Canada on the 10th and 11th of July, and while you have, I understand the invitations haven't gone out yet, a very high number of individuals in the room who are key decision makers in many of the countries we want to influence, that is the time to call upon them to sign up to certain key pledges. So one obvious pledge is one which I know has been supported by my colleague Amal Clooney, and that's a transparency pledge, that when there is a trial of a journalist or a media organisation, that should be open, there should be open justice in those cases, and that in itself can be hugely helpful. Sunlight can be a very effective disinfectant, and that's something where there could be an ask at that event. So if countries are present and don't sign up to it, that in itself could be something that could be picked up on by journalists, could be commented on, and in itself that will give an incentive to people to comply. I also think the proposal for a mechanism in relation to investigating deaths of journalists and learning lessons promptly on deaths of journalists that we've referred to is an obvious thing where you could ask people to sign up to that, and we can give you more detail on that proposal. So those key dates are important to call on states publicly to sign up and comply, but that only goes so far. Second issue is obviously leadership on issues close to home, and I've mentioned the importance of the UK being seen to speak out on key issues where it has a UK national affected or where it's a country with whom it has influence, like Myanmar, like Malta. And just on that, I should mention Jeremy Bliss is here, and his cousin Christopher Allen was killed in August 2017. He's a dual US-UK national. I suspect many of you in the committee didn't know about his case until you knew that he was coming. That, I think, shows a real problem in circumstances where this is a UK national who was killed in South Sudan, And I spoke to his parents yesterday with Jeremy. His parents don't know the most basic questions about what happened in his case. How many people were killed with him, if it was an ambush, if he was targeted deliberately. They simply don't know. And it is unacceptable that almost 2 years later they are left without answers to those most basic of questions. And this is a UK national who was affected. And the Foreign Office has been involved at a low level in his case for a very long period of time. And that's a real example. So if we are going to show real leadership, it can't just be leadership on a case like Maria Ressa or journalists in Mexico. It's got to be leadership on UK nationals who are affected, European Union countries, Council of Europe countries that are affected. And my concern is there's some radio silence on some of those issues closer to home, but a lot more shouting about issues further away. And the third point on funding, I entirely agree about capacity building. I think it's very important to look at the superb work that's done on freelancers by people like the Rory Peck Foundation, for example, because often there's a particular funding gap for those journalists. And I also do think it's excellent that we've got a legal panel scrutinising legislation. But one of the key issues for many of my clients is that they've been left in a circumstance where local lawyers can't represent them or can't represent them effectively because local lawyers themselves are placed under huge pressure. We've seen that in Egypt, where local lawyers get accused of being connected to the Muslim Brotherhood if they even act for Al Jazeera journalists, or if they even act for other journalists who are themselves accused of terrorism offences. And I do think that the FCO could give some thought to having the equivalent of the panel that it has on public international law, and a panel of individuals who could in fact act for the individual journalists who are left without legal support, and could make submissions to the UN and could give them advice. So that's a very practical example, because at the moment those cases come to us in a range of ways, but I'm sure there are many people who aren't represented and who need representation.
Follow up on the case of Mr. Allen and your criticism of the FCO and their lack of knowledge. Why do you think that is? Is it capacity on the ground? Is it the fact that this person was a dual national and therefore expecting the State Department to pick it up? What was the problem there?
Of course. We can give you more detailed submissions on that in writing, and I'm quite conscious that I've got instructions and I'll need to check precisely what I say. So I can give you a brief headline answer. I think it's quite right that the UK appears to have weighed in on that case behind the US and has assumed the State Department will do a lot of the running. But one of the particular difficulties here is there is an entitlement for a bereaved family under Section 1 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009, under a piece of domestic legislation, that if a body from abroad returns to the UK, they're automatically entitled to have an inquest once the coroner is informed. And that is something which this family would very much like to have availed of, but they didn't know about it. So in fact, Christopher's body went via Heathrow in international transit, so no coroner within London was informed that he was here, and his body then went to San Diego. And they're in a position where, really due to a technicality and due to a lack of knowledge at the time about what their entitlements were, they haven't had an inquest. And there's plainly no investigation taking place in South Sudan for a range of reasons which this committee will well understand. But they were very close to having an investigation within the UK in the same way you would have if a British national died in custody in Spain and their body returned here. So I think there is a real issue about whether the family should be having an investigation here into what happened in circumstances where there's no accountability or investigation within Sudan itself. In terms of why this happened, I think a large part of it seems to be because he was a dual national, US-UK. It appears that it fell between multiple stools. There was also some UN involvement in the ground, and also at the time there was a really practical issue about the difficulty of getting his body out. And I think all eyes were on getting his body out and getting it to a place where his family could then accept his body and grieve. And it's only later that it's become apparent that they're not getting answers from the Sudanese authorities, and they need answers and an investigation elsewhere.
Come in.
I apologise, I had to leave earlier to make an argument in another committee for a debate on international humanitarian law. But I'll catch up with the evidence that you gave later. I wanted to ask you about Turkey. You may have already mentioned Turkey, but we all know the number of journalists who are in prison in Turkey, many of whom I met before they went to prison. And I know how afraid journalists are to do their job in Turkey. And given that there's going to be a new election in Istanbul by order of President Erdogan, and how difficult it is going to be for journalists there to report on the comings and goings on the new election. How do you think we can help journalists, given that we've got some influence in Turkey? How do you think we can help journalists in that country practice their profession?
I think it's a very difficult one. But certainly in terms of what's happened to journalists in Turkey, it's gone from journalism being repressed and journalists being repressed to journalism that is totally oppressed. And so journalists themselves are in a completely different space from where they were even before, before the coup. So, and it is the biggest jail. I think it is literally, again, it's public and private condemnation of the situation. And to actually also say that the world for journalists in Turkey has changed an awful lot. It's not stayed the same, it's just getting worse and worse, and that this isn't acceptable. I think that's the main message, and we can show that, we can evidence it. We've just done some interviews with journalists in Turkey. We can't actually even identify their news organisations. We can't identify who they are. We can't identify if they're male or female, or which part of the country they come from. And that just speaks to, the fear that's already growing, that's grown exponentially over the last few years. So it is public condemnation in the strongest terms.
Implication from talking to others in Europe that Germany does this far better than we do. And we do training programs for journalists in Turkey, and therefore give them an international renown and support, which we don't do any of.
I think the UK is pretty silent on Turkey. It comes back to some of the things we've already said about Malta and Turkey and places a bit closer to home. So it would be fantastic if there was more pressure placed and more condemnation.
And I've had, at the Reuters Institute, for example, requests from Turkish journalists who would love to come and be a journalist fellow at the Reuters Institute, because through the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which also does brilliant work in development of journalism internationally, but there is such a chilling effect that even putting your hand up for one of these fellowships, exposes you to long-term risk. And I think we do have a responsibility to enable the withdrawal, to provide refuge for these journalists. And one of the great benefits, and we haven't talked much about this, of digital media is the capacity to do great journalism remotely. So perhaps there's opportunities that you might want to investigate, cognizant of the risks to these journalists if they must go back to Turkey, but to enable them to come. And I know you're doing some of this with the Sheffield fellowships that have been announced. But to enable more of that kind of collaboration and cooperation between Turkish journalists and journalists from this country, for example, a chance to provide both refuge and an opportunity for reflection at an institute like the Reuters Institute, and there are several others. But also, I would say, to ensure that in your attempts to represent this to your constituents, to your publics, that you go beyond reiterating what we're saying here and you try to find ways to explain why this is important to you sitting in, Village X. Why is journalism valuable to us? Why is it essential to our way of life? And we, even as journalists, we struggle to report on these things, but we have to find powerful ways of explaining to people, if they do not have access to reliable, quality information that they can trust, that does put a spotlight uncomfortably sometimes on people like you, that their lives ultimately will be worse off. And the stories of journalists in Turkey and journalists in other parts of the world where oppression is extreme sometimes wash over people in the way that stories of famine and disaster wash over audiences. But we have to find ways to powerfully describe the ultimate value of independent journalism and the life-risking moves of journalists.
You made the point yourself. You spoke about the cross-border abuse and troll farms. Well, we're seeing it in the UK, and so the idea that media freedom or rather the lack of media freedom in Russia in any way makes us more free is clearly complete rubbish. It makes us more at risk, as we're seeing the tyrannical abuses of the Russian state used against the liberties that British people traditionally thought that they could enjoy with impunity. It turns out we can't. It turns out we're just as affected by the abuses of tyrannical regimes, whether they're in Russia or indeed in any of the other countries you mentioned, and the abuses come straight back here to the UK.
Just two very quick things on Turkey. I agree very much with what's been said. And on the point about remote journalism, there's many examples of really superb remote journalism. BBC Persian's a very good example, or Deutsche Welle's Iranian reporting by journalists who've been in exile, essentially, and have been unable to return to Tehran or to elsewhere in Iran since the elections a decade ago. So there are examples of people doing superb, cutting-edge reporting from a distance. Just two practical things on Turkey. The first thing is, and this is an example where I'm not criticising the UK, but I'm saying the UK could perhaps show leadership in relation to the Council of Europe. There is a real concern in many of those Turkish cases that the European Court of Human Rights has been so unwilling to use its mechanisms to protect journalists or indeed others who are targeted, like academics, for example, at an earlier stage. And there is a real question for many of us who work in the field about the exhaustion of domestic remedies mechanisms, so the requirement that you must go through all the hoops within Turkey before you can ultimately go to the European Court of Human Rights in circumstances where there's real questions about the rule of law within Turkey.
Is there almost a reticence in Western countries to push what we see as values-based policies, as though the values of freedom of speech, freedom of association and freedom of assembly are in some way Western values rather than just human values?
I don't think that's the particular issue here. I think here many of the organisations who've been supporting some of those journalists, like Reporters Without Borders or PEN, for example, and many of the individual very brave lawyers who are working for those journalists within Turkey have found that when they contact the European Court of Human Rights to say, might we be able to apply for some form of interim protection, they're told you're way off. You've got to go through all of the hoops within the Turkish courts before you can come. And there is a real issue about that. It's not just about Turkey, it's also about Russia. There's many Council of Europe states where I think there is some work to be done on strengthening the interim mechanisms and dealing with the exhaustion of domestic remedies bat off, which often means that cases have to spend years trawling through courts domestically in Council of Europe states which simply don't respect their position. And then the other issue, just to mention about Turkey, one of the particularly pernicious aspects of what's happening with Turkey is the targeting of journalists' families. So many of you will know about the case of Jan Dündar, for example, and other Turkish journalists who are here in exile, but they then have family members who remain in Turkey or they've got property in Turkey. And what they're told is, if you don't return to face trial, we're essentially holding your family member or your property hostage. And the result, if you don't return to face trial, will be that your family member will be homeless. And that's where this cross-governmental issue is so important, because that is precisely the kind of situation where we've got to ensure that the Home Office is married up with the Foreign Office on visa issues when family members then apply for visas. And I'm afraid I'm aware of quite a few cases where family members have been refused visas in circumstances where the Foreign Office quite rightly recognises that the journalist in exile here is at risk. And that mirrors the situation I referred to earlier in relation to BBC Persian. It's all the more important, all the more reason why we've got to ensure this is a cross-governmental priority, not just Foreign Office focused only.
Otherwise, effectively, you're forcing the journalist home to see their family.
Yes, and that's been the same for a number of dual UK Turkish nationals who are academics who signed a petition criticising some issues about lack of academic freedom in Turkey. And the result has been they're essentially told, unless you return for your first appearance in Turkey, the result will be there's a warrant out for your arrest. There'll be implications for your family members within Turkey, and you won't be able to see your family members again. So they're kind of starved out, and they're in a position where they've got to return, despite it being extremely risky. And that's not a situation that we should be putting up with for UK Turkish nationals who are here, where this should be a place of refuge. We should be protecting them and preventing them having to return in that way.
Can I just make a point to you? The Interparliamentary Union deals with the human rights of parliamentarians. So the committee that I sit on in Geneva, which meets several times a year, looks at the human rights of politicians, and they get the countries concerned to come before the committee and answer questions. Now, there should be something similar for journalists, I think, because it's quite effective in the case of politicians. I myself have been to Turkey on 2 occasions to visit MPs in jail. And we've managed to get them out of jail. So, you know, the pressure that that sort of organisation can put on a country like Turkey as far as politicians are concerned, is very considerable. So there should be something similar for journalists.
I'm going to come in on. Are you on the same theme, or go on then very quickly?
Just on Turkey in particular. Turkey obviously has a very significant bilateral relationship with the United Kingdom. Are any of you aware of any bilateral representations that have been made on specific cases, such as on visas of journalists and protections and rights? And do you have a view as to whether or not, and I appreciate most of the discussion today has been focused on institutions, whether it's the UN, UNESCO, Council of Europe, but do you think there's more scope for pressing on these very issues at a bilateral level? And do you see other countries acting in this sphere too?
The short answer is, I'm just thinking, I can't give a huge amount of detail, but I can see if I can take instructions to give you more information. Okay. I am aware of some bilateral submissions being made in some individual cases, effectively in a number of cases. But it's a little patchy, in my experience, and I'm a little unclear on why that is. I'll see if I can give you some more information, but I'll have to take instructions from some of my clients. I certainly think there's more scope for pressing more, and I agree entirely with what Jackie said earlier as well about the need to condemn in the strongest terms what is a crackdown on anyone perceived as being an opponent of the regime in Turkey, which extends not just to journalists but also to academics and others.
Civil society.
And civil society more generally. And I do think the UK could be saying more publicly, certainly privately behind the scenes in some individual cases, and the Foreign Office has been extremely helpful.
Thank you.
Can I just come on to two other videos that we've been received from the IPI, as I was telling you about. Joan Chirwa, talking about Zambia, and Daoud Kutab, talking about the Middle East, raised a further problem that you touched on, Ms. Posetti, which was that a lot of the media is owned by politicians, wealthy individuals, and other vested interests, and that effectively can cause a form of censorship, simply not running stories that would otherwise be critical of them. What can the UK do to support independent ownership? We're going to come on to the BBC in a moment, so maybe hold off on any answers about that.
There's a number of ways that you could consider intervening, and one of the first I suggest is support for collaborative investigative journalism. So there are various international organisations such as the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which is cross-border. If you remember the Panama Papers story probably most prominently from what they've done. There are similar organisations based in regions around the world that enable collaborative reporting between journalists across borders, but that goes beyond publications, which can shine. This is certainly true in the case of Malta. I mean, there was Panama Papers were clearly featuring reporting that was coming out of Malta as part of that collaboration. But you can enable skills development through that kind of investment, and enable a degree of shielding of the individual journalists in the countries where it's most difficult to do this kind of independent reporting through this kind of network approach, if you like. So you're developing skills, you're potentially increasing the protective network that journalist is a member of. I'm not suggesting you go in and start funding British or UK government-funded media outlets in these countries. And I don't know if you're aware, but there's certainly a story by way of sidebar today involving the Hungarian government reaching into the UK and establishing a news organisation here. Yes, if you've got to check The Guardian, by way of application by a diplomat based with the Hungarian embassy here. So what's happening in that case is a reverse of this situation, where they've established a news organisation, online publication, and funded this, which focuses almost exclusively on migration and asylum seeker type issues. So it was a way of pushing far right political agendas. So this is a geopolitical reality. I would just come back to what I mentioned before about the capacity to do soft diplomacy through really specifically funding projects such as the BBC World Services operations, and perhaps thinking of creative and new ways to enable the kind of journalism that the BBC World Service has traditionally done. And again, BBC Media Action in partnership with the World Service, but it's not an exclusive club. It's not that the BBC is the only organisation capable of doing this, but that kind of work can be very valuable in strengthening a response within countries where it's just impossible to get stories published of a critical nature.
Because actually, on that very issue, Ms. Posetti, can I ask, just to follow up on that, and I'd be grateful for any other views that other panellists have as well. BBC bureaus and the World Service does have, that outreach across the world. But can you just expand on that? To what extent is that good for local journalism and supporting local journalism?
Yeah.
And to what extent does it squeeze it out? Because I was really interested in terms of, enhancing local journalism is, of course, it's something that's incredibly important to us, but also it's important worldwide as well.
Just from many of the journalists, I won't name them and I won't identify specifically which countries, that we have hosted at the Reuters Institute over the past year. The work that the BBC World Service does and some of the projects that linger from BBC Media Action in particular and Thomson Reuters Foundation have been highlighted as being valuable in a range of ways. With the World Service, it's partly about modelling independent quality journalism. So in many countries, there isn't necessarily an established local model, or that model has been so weakened and so disempowered that the very training of journalists to develop the skills to do this kind of accountability reporting that strengthens governance is absent. So it's a modelling process, but I think it could go further. I think figuring out ways to enable the BBC to be more nimble in these environments where they can collaborate with other news organisations, to have local news media partners, for example. You'd have to be quite careful about which you chose. But this form of journalism genuinely, and if it can come through hands-off funding to support the development of independent journalism in these contexts, and I think that would be extremely valuable. So it works in two ways. It works as a way of providing credible quality information to an audience, but also to model behaviours connected to robust independent reporting for other journalists. I understand your question is a good one around whether it squeezes out other players, but in my experience and expertise, it generally is effective more than anything. And I've seen it in Australia and the UK being eroded, frankly, and budget lines being removed. And I think that we are now seeing, in response to this global disinformation crisis, a return to reinvesting appropriately in these processes. Sorry, yes.
World Service. My name is, I haven't had a chance to introduce myself. My name is Olga Robinson, and I'm a senior journalist with the BBC Monitoring Disinformation team. I specialise in Russia because I'm Russian, and I've worked for most of my life in Russia as a monitoring journalist who specialises in Russian media environment. And I would say I witnessed myself how the 2020 funding helped. Sure, of course. When I was in Russia, I witnessed myself firsthand how the 2020 program that allowed some additional funding from the government to the World Service, BBC Russian is one of those services, how it allowed journalists working for the BBC Russian to build their profile in Russia as a source of information, a reliable, trustworthy, balanced and impartial, independent source of information. And when I joined the BBC 6 years ago, the BBC Russian in general was very, very rarely cited by the Russian media. But I just recently checked some available stats on their performance provided by Russian media analytics company, and the stats were quite impressive in my personal opinion, because BBC Russian was number 8 as most cited media on social media in Russia, which is quite good. And also it was number 20 in a number of sightings in Russian media, which again is something that when I joined wasn't the case. And also among independent Russian, very few remaining independent Russian pundits and analysts, the BBC Russian newsroom at the moment is seen as one of the best, if not the best, in Russia available, and some of their journalism it counters and challenges the narratives on the Skripals, the Russian interference in the US, and some of the fascinating work is also translated then into English. And I think this kind of facts speak for themselves, really. Thank you.
Can I make a really quick point on law? Sorry, never the most attractive start to a sentence. But some of the larger organisations, including the BBC World Service, have actually shown real leadership in some countries on legal issues, which then benefits much smaller organisations who don't have pockets that are as deep and could never deal with those points. So just to give you an example, two examples. Al Jazeera has brought a challenge in relation to investment treaty arbitration against Egypt on the basis that it invested in Egypt on the assumption that Egypt complied with international human rights standards. It signed up to the Universal Declaration. It's got a constitution which says that it respects freedom of expression, but in fact its investment was a flawed one because Egypt doesn't in fact comply with that. And that's quite important. And the BBC World Service, the work that it's done on Iran, supported very well by the Foreign Office, has also been really groundbreaking, because actually highlighting the cross-border nature of the harassment of BBC Persian journalists like Kazra Naji, who sits behind me, has been very helpful for Deutsche Welle, a much smaller operation, who are also affected, and much smaller operators like Radio Farda, for example. So others who are also experiencing that kind of cross-border harassment, but who wouldn't have had the resources and weren't able to take leadership on this issue, I think are greatly benefiting from the fact that the World Service has done that work. So that's my legal point. I hope I'll be forgiven for raising that.
And I'm sorry, just a very general point. The BBC also has given support by working with local journalists on big stories, so Ghanaian corruption, for example. So again, it's influenced in terms of facilitating investigative journalism that may or may not have happened in particular contexts.
And I'm so sorry, just on that issue, I mean, legal threats often, what I find in much of my work, and my colleague Jonathan Price, who sits behind me, is working on a case in Kenya at the moment, which is being fought by the BBC, where many local organisations wouldn't have been able to do it. Often the chilling effect comes just from the legal threat. So an organisation gets a threat and they just take the story down and they can't fight it. And it's critically important, actually, that organisations like the BBC or like Al Jazeera do fight it, and that benefits everyone.
Let me ask a question. I mean, obviously, there'll be channels, the BBC is part state-funded, and you've got channels like RT, Press TV, who would like to compare themselves to the BBC and who would argue that they offer a greater diversity of views. Now, what distinguishes these channels from the BBC? And I'd be really interested in what any of you have got to say on that. Ms. Robinson, you're probably best placed.
Monitoring Russia Today and Sputnik on a daily basis for years now. I can say that there is a difference between Russia Today, or as it is now known, RT, and the BBC, because the BBC is editorially independent from the government or market, whereas Russian, as one of its senior editors, Margarita Simonyan, the editor-in-chief, said in a 2012 interview, if I'm not mistaken, to Russian media, they see themselves as an equivalent of a defense ministry. So some kind of entity that really is there to protect Russian interests, and in case of a conflict, they can step up and be something akin to a defense ministry. And she said, at that point of time, we are not waging any wars with anyone, but the defense ministry is always there, prepared for a war, and so should we. And I think this kind of line and this attitude is what sets the BBC apart from Russia Today, although I know that RT editors and journalists very often say that we are no different.
Anybody else?
Yeah, as a media scholar and somebody who has been at events where a now quite prominent South African working for Russia Today, who's the Middle East correspondent, will stand up, often flanked by Russians who are travelling with her making the argument that this is an independent service. It just happens to have the Kremlin perspective, and I would agree with what Olga has suggested, that the distinction is editorial independence at the BBC. Certainly the BBC World Service or Radio Australia, from my homeland, have reputations as being as offering UK perspective on issues, but that's different from a Downing Street perspective on issues. And I think that's the point that needs to be.
I do agree with that, because very often Russian media, Russian state media, and some of the officials point out that the BBC is there to promote the UK and its and its values and its culture. But what they don't notice that the public purpose of the BBC, there is a continuation of that line which says that the BBC is there to provide high quality content that is based on the values of accuracy, fairness and impartiality, and that is normally just ignored or not said, but it is essentially key.
And you don't think the fact that the Foreign Secretary has a role in the strategic decision making has an impact on perceptions elsewhere in the world?
Do you mean the Foreign Secretary?
Yeah, the Foreign Secretary. In terms of setting
BBC strategic decision making. I have not, other than debates with RT journalists, I have not heard that specifically said. I will say, though, that public broadcasting needs to be understood and identified as quite distinct from state broadcasting. What we have here is public broadcasting. And I think one of the things that perhaps the committee could do in response to reinforcing the distinctions is to very much ensure that in public discourse, because the BBC, like other public broadcasters around the world, is frequently used as some kind of political pawn, in my observations, where it might be perceived to be having a particular political alignment, which, given my observations and expertise, I think is an unfair judgment. And I think we should probably recommend to you that there be an understanding of those distinctions between state and public broadcaster, and a decision to embrace the robust critique that the BBC is sometimes criticised over, and other public broadcasters, because it's that which distinguishes the BBC from propagandistic networks like RT. So that comes with our maturity, I think, as a state.
And if I may, I think it's the kind of viewer that the different organisations speak to or even foster. So, for example, the BBC is very much trying to, I believe, foster citizenship, civil interlocutors, for us to not be consumers, not to be partisans. In other words, the whole rationale of that is quite different, and it's a creation of a different sort of civil capacity or public capacity to interrogate, to hold politicians to account, to hold power to account. It is desperately there to give us the tools. That's what that's its public purpose, which is different from supporting of a particular regime. In fact, it's massively different. Yeah. It's the opposite.
I agree with what's been said by Olga, Julie and Jackie. This is an unusual panel. We're all agreeing with each other. But just three quick additional supplementary points. The first one is Julie's suggestion that this committee correct any misperception on this point. I very much agree with. And I find, and BBC Persian's a good example of this, that the connection is sometimes used as a stick to beat journalists with. And quite rightly, that was criticised and condemned by the BBC World Service, by us as their lawyers, and by others, including by the Foreign Office last year, when Iran tried to say in March 2018 that the BBC Persian service is simply an arm of the intelligence services. I think those of you who are members of government and have been at the receiving end of criticism from the BBC would be surprised to the BBC being described as an arm of government. But that certainly is, whether it's a misperception or it's just a tool it's a phrase which is used wrongly, it's certainly a concept which needs to be stamped out and needs to be corrected. Second point is, I think we need to be quite careful. We're dealing with apples and pears when we look at Press TV, Mizan newspaper, Russia Today, and then state broadcasters who are represented by the European Broadcasting Union, including the BBC World Service, they're wholly different for the range of reasons that Julie and Jackie have given, and I think it's quite important that we make that distinction very clear. And then thirdly, on editorial independence, I'm conscious that people have referred to the World Service's editorial independence and that being at the forefront of its work. I think it's important to remember that it's a public corporation. The way it's governed and funded is obviously set out by Royal Charter, and the Charter itself stipulates the provision of the Royal Service guarantees its editorial independence as well as its editorial guidelines. And of course, with the W2020 funding, there was a guarantee from government that the funding was provided without strings attached and editorial independence was guaranteed. So we're in wholly different territory to the Russia Today, Mizan, Press TV scenario, and we should make that very clear.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
The two journalists who have had the rare good news who reported on the Rohingya, do you feel that the BBC played a role? Because it has been widely reported on the BBC, and also obviously there's that strong relationship which goes back a long way. Do you feel that that was part of unlocking that one, or what was it that made the difference in that good outcome? Because what we would like is that, but in Turkey and in other places.
Yes.
What were the key elements of that worked in the case of the Myanmar
Certainly. So my colleague Amal Clooney acts for Reuters and for the journalists, and I'm not sure if you've seen her quote today welcoming the outcome. I think she quite rightly paid tribute to the work that Reuters had done. And Reuters have been superb on this case, and it's a real model for other media organisations if something like this happens to their journalists. So they've had it at the top of their agenda, they put money into it, they had a widespread campaign, they got a legal team on board, and they've put pressure at every possible level. I think they've done a superb job. Similar job was done by the Washington Post in relation to Jason Resign, for example, where people actually put their column space where their mouth was, and ensured that actually it was prioritised and a focus was given to the case. I think that certainly made a difference. I obviously think that having Amal acting for them and doing the work that she's done has been hugely helpful. I think Reuters' work has been very helpful. I do think the international pressure that was brought to bear on Myanmar by countries with influence, including by the UK, has been very important, hugely important. And I think it was a combination of matters behind the scenes and publicly which helped. But I do think it was very clear to Myanmar that the world was watching, and that if they didn't use one of the mechanisms available to them to free the journalists, that additional pressure would be brought to bear upon them. I think that's been very helpful, and that combination of factors has been very helpful in many other cases. But I do want to pay tribute to the work by Reuters, and it's been superb.
Thanks, Chair.
Can I just add one small point? Very briefly. I agree with the assessment of Reuters. I think something to bear in mind is that the profession of journalism has been reluctant historically to actually be activist on press freedom issues. It's seen as belly gazing. I think we're starting to see a shift, and I think it's an important shift. And I think the BBC could be encouraged further on that. And I'm starting to see some different perspectives being expressed, because it is vital.
Well, something that my clients often say to me is, as a journalist, the last thing you want to do is become the story yourself. And I'm afraid journalists who are placed under pressure in the way BBC Persian were, or in the way that journalists in Egypt or Myanmar or elsewhere have had no choice but to become the story. And I very much agree with that. And I think solidarity from other journalists around the world has been hugely helpful. We saw that with the Free Al Jazeera staff campaign. And where that's all the more important is where you have a freelancer. So where you have someone who doesn't have the support of a network, it's so important that someone like the International Federation of Journalists and other individual journalists come on board to amplify their voices and shout from the rooftops.
Chair. I'm a guest of the committee today, so I sit on the DCMS Select Committee, and you'll know that we've been doing a long inquiry into disinformation and fake news, so I wanted to ask a couple of questions about that. From your perspective, Julie, and then Olga, who are the main perpetrators of disinformation and the impact, obviously, that's having negatively on press freedom?
So the first thing I would say is, I know you've probably heard this a lot, but I do think it's actually important to work on labelling, and I've seen some of the work that the committee has done. I think it becomes problematic when we conflate disinformation, misinformation, malicious information, and fake news, particularly because of the way in which fake news has been weaponised by state actors, from Duterte in the Philippines, Trump in the US, and so on. So I just want to make that point up front. It's a combination of perpetrators. It is state actors, and I mentioned before we're seeing evidence-based assessment that state trolling or state-orchestrated disinformation campaigns exist in state-linked, at least, in India, the Philippines, Brazil. We've certainly seen it in South Africa as well. So they can be political parties or they can be the state apparatus. We've seen corporate actors. We've seen, certainly in the case of Bell Pottinger, our own UK public relations firm, which was deeply entrenched in the disinformation campaigns exposed by the Daily Maverick in South Africa. The report I mentioned earlier details some of this. It's also, unfortunately, a feature of state trolling that these could be loose or loosely orchestrated groups that, in the case of targeting journalists and audiences, are fomenting their strategies and their activities on other sites like 4chan, for example, and then piling on to more mainstream social media sites. It's special interest groups, from those who are in anti-vaxxing territory to climate change denialists. This is a broad gamut of actors, and I think, though, probably the most urgent and the most dangerous is this combinant effect which we see through these orchestrated campaigns. And arguably, this is what is under investigation on a range of levels in the US, with external actors interfering, and I presume this is one of the reasons we're here. So that's to give you an overview. The biggest targets are journalists among them, and as I said before, specifically women journalists, because it's very effective to try to shut down critical journalism by targeting news brands or individual reporters, and to increasing exponentially the risk that they face, putting demands on their time that they can't meet. And we have to understand this is all happening in the context of defunded, business model collapsed, self-publication capable populations, massive changes in the distribution of information. And we're in a sludgy environment where there is so much information pollution, if you like, that it's not just misdirecting and misleading and in other contexts being weaponised, but we're at the same time seeing the drowning out of quality, credible information. So we have multiple features of this situation.
Thank you. So, Olga, it sounds like you spend a lot of your time in this sludgy information arena. What do you think?
Well, I specialise in Russia, but I first would like to say just a few words about the term disinformation, because the term that we tend to use in monitoring and the wider BBC is that disinformation is false or misleading information that is spread deliberately with the purpose of misleading your audience or deceiving them, and also with the purpose of benefiting personally, commercially, or politically from it. And the key element here would be the intent, the deliberate spread of such information. So as for perpetrators, I agree with Julie, there are all sorts of perpetrators out there, and from individuals who just spread disinformation, even for vanity reasons, just to dupe the world, and tell everyone about it. But there are also wider sort of loose groups. There are perpetrators of political disinformation, and there are also commercial disinformation disseminators, which are often overlooked because these are sometimes called merchandisers, merchants of fake news and disinformation. And what they do is that they get money from advertising, and they target ordinary people who just browse internet, and they target them with clickbait. And they get money through it, and quite a lot of money actually. And it seems to be that examples of that can be found in Eastern Europe, and the BBC recently did a story about it, about one of the Kosovo merchants of fake news. Also, of course, talking about disinformation is not possible to talk about political disinformation, which gets a lot of debates and a lot of attention now. And when talking about political groups, first of all, it could be individual, like Julie said, it could be individual groups or loosely defined groups that target specific individuals or companies or media organizations. And that could also include state-sponsored disinformation. And the perpetrators from that perspective, the first thing that comes to mind is Russia, Iran, and China. And I'll explain why. Russia and Iran, as we've seen over the past few years, there's evidence of them being involved in covert influence operations aimed at disrupting elections and influencing debates, not necessarily political, for example in vaccines as well, abroad. And I would say that that kind of puts them on one side of the spectrum. But China is a slightly different case because we haven't seen examples and evidence of it being involved in covert operations abroad, in my line of work at least. But it does use its soft power to spread messages beneficial to it and some of its talking points through traditional media abroad and also through the operation of its state-funded media, such as the Chinese Global Television Network, which has recently opened an office in London and is currently hiring over 300 people in the UK. And also, of course, talking about China, it does control the debate inside the country quite tightly. And the same goes to largely to Russia when it comes to traditional media in particular, whereas the discussions and debates on social media have a bit more freedom and leeway. For how long, we don't know, given that we are now dealing with the Sovereign Internet Initiative and all the rest.
Okay. And from a journalistic perspective, where do you think the main mouthpieces of the disinformation that you've described are coming from now? Is it traditional media or is it social media?
It's a combination of those things. And I think one of the things we probably need to put on record and be mindful of is that while we sit here defending media freedom and independent journalism, I think the disinformation crisis needs to be understood as a warning as well for traditional news organisations which perhaps have not operated with the strongest ethics or have not operated with the public interest underlined as their objective. And I have examples from my own experience where some of the worst, what we might call now trolling, has actually been orchestrated by particular segments of the mainstream press. So we need to be, while defending absolutely the rights of news organisations to operate and to practice, I think mindful that what exists as a part solution and an important defence against disinformation is the reinforcement of quality, independent, robust journalism, and the ways in which we fund that are important and perhaps things for the committee to take into account in your own committee. So that being said, we have to understand social media as being it's not an organisation of news outlets. Social media is the platform. It's like saying TV is social media is the platform where obviously a combination of self-publication can occur by citizens, where state actors can bypass the critical role of a free press to go direct to audiences to build their own communities around their disinformation messages, for example.
There's an element there that's not quite the same in the sense that newspapers and media outlets, traditional media outlets, act as publishers and therefore have a responsibility for the message, not just the transmission. And social media refuse to accept that they're publishers when in fact they are, under any reasonable description of it. They curate, they they assess information. They just refuse to take any responsibility for it.
But they're not. The one distinction I think we have to be careful of, I'm not disagreeing with your point, is that by and large social media platforms are not publishing their own content. There certainly is an argument they're responsible for what others are publishing, but they're not fulfilling a kind of role of
that could be said of the BBC under its new contract arrangements with.
Sure. So social media is an enabler of viral, instantaneous disinformation, and the biggest problem we have is the way in which, when spread, disinformation or misinformation is extremely difficult, nigh on impossible to pull back. We can debunk, we can emphasise fact-checking, we can invest in those kinds of forms of journalism that focus on telling the stories of disinformation and trying to clear away some of the crud. But ultimately we're in a situation with, as you allude to, Chair, the role of the platforms being essential to the way in which we respond to these crises. So the sources of disinformation are many and varied. The primary amplification of disinformation is a set of social media platforms which are both important to our capacity to access reliable information, but dangerous in terms of the ways in which disinformation has spread like wildfire. I mean, terms that are overused and cliched now are kind of, I'm just given up, avoiding using them, but Wild West, it really is. And
that balance between allowing expression,
exactly.
freedom of expression, but having some element of regulation like you would do as a broadcaster or a print media.
Or even robust self-regulation.
It's very difficult,
which is essential and part of, if you talk about British gift of self-regulated journalism to the world, and that's something to think about in terms of understanding this biggest challenge we have with regards to social media platforms, which is how to enable the free expression, which has... I mean, in Ethiopia, for example, journalists there were saying, but social media is great, it's given us a chance to have a new Prime Minister, and they shut down the jail where so many journalists were imprisoned, partly because of social media activism. So these are, just to think for the sake of a bit of balance, we need to appreciate that.
Well, can I just ask Caoilfhionn, I know France and Germany have legislated in relation to social media platforms. From your experience, do you think that is working? Can we learn from that? Can we learn good things from it, or are you concerned about any...
I think curate's egg is the very short answer, and I think we certainly can learn some things from it, and maybe helpful for me to address it in a bit more detail in writing, if that would be helpful.
Okay,
I think there are some points of detail on France and Germany's approach, and indeed on the Netherlands' approach, maybe I could pick up in writing for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Not to be speaking about Russia, if I may. I know that Russia has been using European experience in enabling it to basically justify its own fake news legislation, which might sound ironic, but it's also kind of important because some states do take advantage of these concerns and fears caused by disinformation. Some of them, ironically, are accused of spreading disinformation and are involved in that. And just to comment on your question about the traditional media and social media where we can see disinformation more, I would say that social media in general has contributed to a faster and wider, broader spread of disinformation over the past years. With the development of social media platforms as a news source and as a place where you can share information. So it definitely has contributed to the evolution of disinformation because it previously would come primarily from media, traditional media, newspapers and Pravda, everyone knows about that, in the Soviet Union. But if you look, for example, at the Russian disinformation at the moment, the way it is, the way we see it in our daily work, is that it literally works as a various network that could include officials, state media, pro-Kremlin media, trolls, bots, and actors on Twitter who look ostensibly independent. And they work together as an ecosystem, and they're very loose occasionally, so you may not necessarily be able to trace them back all the way to the Kremlin. But I think it's also essential to understand that it works together. And we've seen examples of multiple narratives being pushed at the same time, or being spread from online into the traditional media, into television, foreign-facing Russian television, into domestic television, and then back to online again. And it is quite fascinating just to see it spread, sometimes just within hours. And we've seen examples of that over the past 5 years. I personally have seen examples of that happen on a number of occasions, from the MH17 downing to the killing of opposition leader, one of the opposition leaders in Russia, Boris Nemtsov, and more recently this Skripal poisoning, the whole campaign around that.
Okay, thank you very much.
And which of the Western media were particularly quick to pick it up and to rebroadcast what was effectively Kremlin propaganda?
Well, in my line of work, I do focus on Russian foreign-facing and domestic media, so I would not be able to answer that question. But the Russian media do pick some of the lines and some of the narratives very quickly, literally in a minute.
So which of the Western media do the Russian media quote to reinforce Kremlin stories?
Well, I would say they very often twist some of the stories that they see being published. So, for example, whenever it suits them, whenever a story in British media or in tabloids, for example, suits their purposes or portrays the West in a more kind of critical way, or in a way that suits their narrative, then they would do it. So I've seen many occasions when particularly British tabloids or German tabloids would be mentioned, but it doesn't mean, basically it means that it kind of works for them to reinforce their narratives of, let's say, there's a lot of talk generally I've seen over the past few years of double standards in the West, in the way the West treats other countries or Russia, for example, and also the alleged feminism gone wrong, Me Too movement. Any examples of undermining that would be used, or presenting it as some kind of feminism gone wrong would be quickly picked up and occasionally used not as an isolated case, but as an example of a broader trend.
There was one very last question I wanted to ask, and I'd be hugely grateful if you could keep this brief, as we've kept you far too long, and so forgive me. But the UK has said it's investing £100 million to counter disinformation. Where would you like to see the money spent? Perhaps we can just, as briefly as possible, go from left to right, right to left. Mr. Posetti.
Warning of that, I would have come up with a shopping list.
Yeah.
Firstly, I would argue that you need to figure out ways to invest in robust, independent journalism, and the ways to strengthen that. I genuinely believe that supporting the development of such journalism is one of the best ways we have to ensure that disinformation is countered. The second thing is an investment in media and information literacy fit for the digital age. So much of what is being taught as media literacy in schools is not even understood in a digital context, and we can all critique, the latest editorial from Murdoch Press publication X, and that's important, or Guardian publication, whatever, but we need to understand the ecosystem, as Olga has suggested, in which we work is vastly more complex. We have a role as citizens now interacting with not just journalists and news producers, but with sources directly, with political actors directly. We have the capacity to do enormous harm without a sense of editorial responsibility. So there is a lot that can be drawn from media education and applied broadly to society. I firmly believe this has to be a cradle-to-grave process now, the kind of ongoing education of citizens. And included in that needs to be specific understanding of how disinformation works in its international contexts, in its context of media ecosystem disruption, and that there are different approaches that are required at different levels for that, but basic capacity to challenge stated narratives, to fact check, and to to have advanced skills in play that enable, for example, networked mapping.
I'm going to hold you back. We've got 100 million, not 100 billion, I'm afraid. So
okay, that's fine. I will stop. Research is the other thing. You take that.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I think you said most of the areas. And one thing that just strikes me is that when it comes to media literacy, part of the problem is that people don't understand the process of gathering information, and that's robust and accurate, honestly told, and that is a disposition towards truthfulness. And that's what actually disaggregates that sort of, or changes that sort of information and moves it away from disinformation, false news. And I think that's part of media literacy. Quite often media literacy starts with the content and looks at it when it's there, and you have to verify it and look at it. But if people understood a little more about the process of gathering reliable, accurate information and being honest about it, that would be a positive place to invest.
I also think I agree entirely with what Jackie and Julie have said in relation to kind of macro investment, if I can put it that way. I also think it's quite important, if this is being taken seriously, that consideration is given to micro focus. So how in individual cases where individual journalists or individual media organisations are the subject of these kind of campaigns, like the Ayatollah BBC campaign and by Iran, or the kind of routine concerted campaign of disinformation about individuals, that some thought is given to funding being available to assist in those particular campaigns. I also think as well, in countering disinformation, much of it is not just about money. Really powerful example of that is about Christopher Allen. When Christopher Allen was accused of being a militant rather than a journalist who was present as a journalist, there was silence from the international community in correcting that. So actually much of countering disinformation in micro cases is just speaking out and saying this is simply not right. And that's something the Foreign Office has done well in relation to BBC Persian, but it should be done in other cases too.
Perfect.
I would say I don't think I'm in a position to offer recommendations on investment, but I would say that at the BBC and my department in particular, we do talk about the need to raise awareness of techniques and trends in disinformation and also promote media literacy. And the BBC, I know that has been doing it with various initiatives. And we've been doing it in my team as well, just to provide context and explain how things work and what to look out for.
Well, can I thank you all very much indeed. You've given some fantastically full and detailed answers for which we're hugely grateful. And I hope you'll see some of your views reflected in where we go on from here. Thank you very much indeed. Order.